In the last lesson, we discussed a few settings for the camera that we have for our shot. We discussed film back, squeeze factor, focal length, and aperture in detail. But if still there is some kind of confusion in your mind, please feel free to ask and let me know, okay? So in today's lesson, we're going to move on and discuss the post-process settings of the camera. Now, before we start discussing these settings, one thing that I like to mention in here is that we're going to adjust most of these settings in the post by using maybe After Effects or DaVinci Resolve. But we're going to discuss these settings anyway so that I can show you what these settings are and how they affect your scene and your shot, okay? So first of all, I'm going to discuss bloom in here. Let's say that if you want to add some bloom in your shot, I'm going to enable this by checking these two boxes. And if I increase the intensity in here, you can see now we have this dreamish sort of look in our shot. You can also see some lens flare in here as well. So if that's what you're looking for, if that's what you want with your shot, you can enable it from here and increase the intensity. But we're not going to need this for our shot, so I'm just going to disable this. If you want some bloom for your shot for some reason, just make sure you go easy with the intensity, okay? So let's move on. Next up, we're going to discuss exposure. I'm going to check these two boxes, and in here, you can see we have these two options, metering mode and exposure compensation. As the name suggests, we can increase or decrease the exposure by using the slider. If I want some extra bit of exposure in my scene, I can increase this value. It's a pretty sensitive slider, so make sure you go easy with this one as well. Okay, I'm going to press Ctrl-Z to undo this. And the other option in here is the metering mode. If I open this drop-down menu, for the most part, you're only going to need auto exposure histogram or manual. Now, if I change this to manual, I'm going to have to adjust the exposure manually, maybe set this to 12. But if I set this to auto exposure histogram, for the most part, the default exposure value is going to work just fine for us. But what actually is the difference between these two? For that, I'm going to have to split this window and enlarge this window. Let's demonstrate the setting by using the demo camera. I'm going to select this one and check these two boxes. So you already know what manual is. If you set this to manual, you're going to have to adjust the exposure. But if you set this to auto exposure histogram, it's going to automatically increase the exposure of your scene if you are at a place where the exposure isn't that much, okay? So let me demonstrate this. I'm going to open this camera preview and let's move. First, let me just disable the focus. And let's say if I move somewhere around here where the exposure isn't that much in my scene, then this setting will automatically increase the exposure of my scene. Right now, it hasn't done so because by default, in the project settings, autofocus is disabled. If I go into Edit and go into Project Settings, and if I search for Auto Exposure and check this box, come out of this one, now you can see it is automatically increasing the exposure of that area. But if I change this to manual and switch this to 12, or maybe 15. Now I'm going to have to manually adjust this slider to adjust the exposure of the scene. Okay. But let's say if I change this to auto exposure histogram, then it's going to automatically adjust the exposure of that area. Now, if I move out of this one and go to a very bright spot where the exposure is too much, it's going to automatically reduce the exposure. But if I move, let's say somewhere around here, it's going to automatically compensate and increase my exposure. Okay. So this is what happens when you set this to auto exposure histogram. Now let's go back to the first shot because there is something important that I want you to know. Okay, so right now the metering mode is set to auto exposure histogram and the exposure value is 1. Now, I'm not sure if you remember this, but in one of the previous lessons, I mentioned that your aperture also affects your exposure. If I enlarge this window, and if I adjust this value right here, it's going to also decrease or increase the exposure as well. But right now you can see by tweaking this number, I'm only affecting the depth of field. I don't really see any change with the exposure. And the reason for that is auto exposure histogram. You can see it is set to auto exposure histogram. So when I tweak my aperture value, it automatically compensates the exposure. But let's say if I change this to manual and manually type in 15, that's probably too much, maybe 12. And now if I tweak this aperture value, you're going to see this change in exposure. Okay. Yeah. So So this is how exposure and aperture are also interlinked with each other. If you set the exposure to manual, you're gonna have to set your aperture and then go down here to adjust the exposure again. But what I like to do is, I just like to keep this at auto exposure histogram and keep the exposure value at default generally, and simply just keep the auto exposure turned off in the project settings, okay? So I'm just gonna go in here and type in auto exposure and switch it off, okay? Now we can set the aperture value without worrying about the exposure. And if you want to change the exposure, I can just do this by using the slider. So let's move on. Next up in here, I have chromatic aberration. Let me check these two boxes. Now, if I increase this value, you're gonna see we have a little bit of color fringing or splitting of RGB in here on the shot. You can see on the edges of this character as well, we have a little bit of color fringing or splitting of RGB. This is actually called as chromatic aberration. We're gonna deal with this in the post, so I'm just gonna disable it. The function of the start offset in here is to simply just limit the chromatic aberration to the edges of the shot, okay? For example, if I bring this number down, we're gonna have chromatic aberration pretty much everywhere in the shot. But if I increase this value to maybe just about there, now you can see we only have this chromatic aberration around the edges of the shot, okay? I'm gonna uncheck these two and let's move on. Next up in here, I have dirt marks. Now, dirt marks can sometimes come in very handy in some very unique situations. You can upload a texture in here and it's gonna apply that texture to your camera. Let's say that if you have a camera inside a particular helmet, a helmet of a robot or something like that. Let's say that that helmet has a translucent material on it and you want to add just a little bit of dust on the glass of that helmet. You can upload a dirt texture in here and it's gonna then apply that texture on your entire shot. So assuming that we have an FPP camera inside the helmet, then we can add a bit of realism by uploading this dirt texture, okay? In our case, we don't really need that, so I'm just gonna uncheck this box. Next up, I want to discuss lens flares. For this, I'm gonna have to first enable the bloom. Let me bring down the intensity to maybe just about there. And by using this lens flare option, I can simply add more or less lens flare in here. We can also add a little bit of tint as well, like so. But I don't really need lens flare for this shot, so I'm just gonna disable it. Let me disable bloom as well, and yeah. Okay. Next up, we have some color grading tools. Let's say that if you want to control the temperature of your shot, you can simply just tweak this number to make your shot look a little bit warmer or cooler, okay? But I don't really need to do that for this shot, so I'm just gonna disable it. Next up in here, we have some global color grading tools such as saturation, contrast, and gamma gain offset. But we're gonna do this in post, so I'm just gonna leave it here, okay? Next up in here, I have global illumination. I'm gonna keep the global illumination method to lumen, and I'm gonna keep these settings as well. These settings can help you to increase the quality of your shot, quality of your scene, but they mostly influence the interiors, so we don't really need to adjust them for our course. So next up in here, I have reflections. I'm gonna keep the reflection method to lumen. You can increase the quality if you want. Let's increase this to 2. And I'm gonna also enable the high quality translucent reflections in here. And I think for the most part, that is pretty much it. Okay, so as you can see, for the most part, all these settings are just fine by default. We just need to tweak a couple of settings in here, and that is pretty much it. Okay, next up in here, I have path tracing. This is a fairly important setting in here, but we're not going to discuss path tracing for now. There's going to be a separate video on path tracing, maybe an entire section if needed. But for now, we don't really need to go into the path tracing settings. We're going to discuss them after the lighting section. Okay, so that's it for this lesson. This was the end of the camera section. In this section, we went over various sort of settings in detail. For the most part, these are all the settings that you need to know for cinematography. Once again, please do let me know if you have some questions about any of these settings, and then I'll try my best to answer them, okay? So that's it for this lesson, and I'll see you guys in the next one.